everyone, and welcome to our podcast presentation. I'm Dr. Mary Bro, and I'm the Crime Victims Institute Director. Our institute here at Sam Houston State University really focuses on advancing research on victimization issues in Texas. We gather information from academic research, professional development, community engagement, and community collaborations. We disseminate that information to victim services organizations, law enforcement, our constituents, and also our community. At this time, I will turn it over to Elise Linares and Taylor Robinson.
Hello, my name is Elise Linares. I received my bachelor's in victim studies from Sam Houston State University, and now I'm pursuing my master's in victim services management.
Hi, my name is Taylor Robinson. I received my bachelor's in criminal justice and minoring in forensic science and my master's in victim service management, and I'm now pursuing my doctorate in criminal justice.
Elise Griesmyer is the Associate Legal Director for Catholic Charities St. Francis Cabrini Center for Immigrant Legal Assistance, the largest nonprofit immigration legal service provider in Houston. In her previous work for the Cabrini Center, Elise served for 8 years as a staff attorney, then managing attorney in the Crime Victims Assistance Program, representing immigrant survivors of serious crimes, including human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and other crimes of violence, to apply for immigration benefits, including humanitarian relief in the form of U visas, T visas, and remedies under the Violence Against Women Act. She works in conjunction with law enforcement agencies and other organizations to provide education and training about the rights of immigrant crime victims, and provides legal Know Your Rights presentations at crisis shelters and community organizations. Before joining Catholic Charities, she worked for Paz and Associates in Houston, Texas, representing clients in criminal, civil, and immigration proceedings. Elise completed her Juris Doctorate in 2009 at the University of Houston Law Center and received a BA from the University of Notre Dame in 2005.
Chris Guerra began the criminal justice PhD program at Sam Houston State in the fall of 2018. He graduated in 2015 from the University of North Texas in Denton with a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology, Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice, and a minor in Spanish. He continued his education at UNT and received a Master of Science degree in criminal justice in May of 2018. He is currently a doctoral candidate and teaching fellow in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. Chris's research interests include immigrant involvement in antisocial behaviors and outcomes, mechanisms of the immigrant paradox, life course criminology, cybercrime, and policing issues.
Ms. Griesmyer, can you explain your background as the Associate Legal Director for St. Francis Cabrini Center for Immigrant Legal Assistance?
Absolutely. So I started my career after law school practicing criminal law for a few years, and then I fell into this role here at Catholic Charities, which I saw as a new path. The Cabrini Center is a nonprofit law firm, so we operate just like a law firm would, but our mission is to serve the immigrant community of Greater Houston. In keeping with our belief in Catholic social teaching, we're here to help the vulnerable and welcome the foreigner. So we practice exclusively immigration law, and I focus my practice specifically in this really small corner of immigration law to help immigrant crime victims obtain immigrant visas that protect them here in the United States.
Chris, can you explain your background as a doctoral teaching fellow and research assistant for the Department of Criminal Justice here at SAM?
I can. Hi. So I'm a third-year PhD student here in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at SHSU. Like Taylor mentioned, I'm a doctoral teaching fellow and research assistant. When it comes to sort of my interest in immigration, I sort of started off my doctoral career here at SAM focusing on cybercrime. So it's definitely been a process. I've evolved as a scholar, and sort of where I landed was sort of my primary research interest is immigrant involvement in antisocial behavior. I primarily focus on life course perspective. So really seeing how immigrant involvement in antisocial behavior, whether it's offending or victimization or alcohol use, stuff like that, changes over the life course, whether it's from early adolescence to adulthood or anywhere in between. And one of the things I focus on primarily is differences across immigrant generations. And we'll get into that here in a little bit, what sort of the differences between that are, but also explaining the immigrant paradox sort of being this contrary to popular discourse, what the public narrative is regarding the immigrant crime link, that in reality, immigrants are the least likely to engage in offending, and in some cases, just sort of depending on how you look at it, less likely to be victims of crime across when you're comparing first generation, a second generation, a third generation, and on. So that's a little bit about my background.
Ms. Griesmyer, who do you consider an immigrant?
When we say immigrant, typically all we mean is someone who was born outside of the United States or has some kind of status in the United States that's lesser than a US citizen or lawful permanent resident. Despite what you might have heard in the last several years or even going back decades, immigrant is not a bad word. So any stigma that we feel associated with that word, I'm trying to take the power out of that. But immigrant is just someone who's here in the United States without permanent status. There are lots of different reasons people come to the United States. Some of them are temporary, some of them are permanent. There's student visas and work visas and agricultural workers, and all different ways that people come here for 2 days, 2 hours, all the way up through the rest of their life. Some people come with status, some people come without, but there's no one definition of an immigrant because there's so many different purposes and lengths of stay and intentions when people come to the United States that it's, even as we continue in this conversation, it's going to be difficult to generalize about immigrants because it's a huge spectrum of people and people are complicated.
Chris, can you define immigrant victimization, and do you have any statistics relating to this type of crime?
Prior to defining immigrant victimization, like Elise just did, I think it is important to define what an immigrant is, and tapping into what an immigrant generation is also pretty important. So like we talked about, being an immigrant, it's a very diverse designation. It varies by race, ethnicity, skin color, socioeconomic status, time in the country, age at first arrival, context of migration, and importantly, legal status. When we consider that, we can also examine it from an immigrant generational standpoint. So first generation immigrants are typically those born outside of the US, when we consider sort of US as sort of the reference point. And whether their parents were also born outside the US, or their mom was born in another country versus here, and then whether dad was born in another country versus here. When you consider that, we can then look at second generation immigrants. Of course, first generation being sort of all parties involved there, being foreign born. Second generation immigrants are more classically referred to as children of immigrants, being somebody who was born in the United States, but had at least one parent that was not. And then you get the third plus generation, which are more the individuals born in the United States, their parents are born in the United States, but maybe a grandparent was born abroad. When you consider that categorization, I think it draws a more sort of nuanced portrait of what an immigrant is. Conceptually, I think it's very classically sort of thinking, to consider an immigrant being somebody that is foreign born. But when you consider the context that children of immigrants embody in the United States, the immigrant experience, there are a lot of sort of overlapping features that would contribute to being an immigrant, so to speak. When we consider immigrant victimization, if I were to provide a broad definition, you can say it's victimization experienced or endured by early generation immigrants. So those in the first generation, maybe the second generation, and maybe the 1.5 generation being those that were born outside the US but came here at an early age, which is what you see in like DACA recipients and whatnot. And how immigrant victimization really is context specific. How this looks varies greatly as the different accumulations of characteristics and circumstances tend to obscure providing a cohesive look at what being an immigrant is and then what immigrant victimization is in general.
Ms. Griesmyer, as the Associate Legal Director, what are the most popular types of cases that you see regarding immigrant victimization?
The most common types of legal cases we see are called U visas, which are for victims of serious crimes that have been designated by Congress, by statute, as qualifying for legal and humanitarian protection in the United States. So of the cases that we do, that's by far the most common type of legal case we work on. We also work on cases called T visas, which are for survivors of human trafficking, and cases called VAWA, which stands for the Violence Against Women Act, for survivors of domestic violence. It's been perpetrated by a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident family member. If we're talking about types of victimization, the most common types that we see a big long list, but the most common and frequent ones we see are domestic violence, sexual assault of minors, some trafficking, manslaughter or murder, aggravated assault, and kidnapping.
Chris, what are the risk factors for immigrant victimization?
I think it's a really good question. And Elise, feel free to jump in here really at any point. I'll just be talking about risk factors for immigrant victimization, sort of in a broad sense. I'll be talking about three: acculturation, sex, and legal status. The first one, acculturation, refers to the socialization process experienced by immigrants as they gradually change their values and behaviors by virtues of their contact with a new culture. It's something heavily experienced the more time that an immigrant spends in the United States. And of course, it's something that the children of immigrants, the second generation group, tends to deal with almost naturally over the course of growing up. As a child of immigrants, it's something that I have endured myself, and it almost acts as, a go-between or a conflict between two different value systems and cultures that require, very hands-on and certain way of looking at things that really impacts the way we go about our life. Acculturation itself is a key process in these broader segmented assimilation perspectives, which suggests that immigrant groups will integrate differently into American society, depending on sort of country of origin and all these different factors. And the general thing is, the more an immigrant becomes acculturated, the more they begin to adapt to native or American value systems and the like, which then increases the risk of victimization, particularly violent victimizations. But again, it is very context dependent. So it really does follow this intergenerational severity gradient where the further you get removed from being an immigrant, so first gen, a second gen, a third gen, and on, the more likely an individual is to offend and to be a victim in general. Next, we'll talk about sex here. The intersection of sex and immigrant generation or status is incredibly important. As Elise said, you tend to see these very types of crimes that really tend to impact women a lot more, or young girls. I'll use the example of intimate partner violence. Traditionally, this disproportionately impacts women more. And I know there was a recent study by Bushra Sabri and colleagues that was published this year. They found a similar outcome as it relates to intimate partner homicides. So being foreign born was a strong predictor of being a victim of intimate partner homicide. And that's just one example among all the literature that demonstrates that sex is a prominent feature, and in many cases can be a risk factor when combined with immigrant status. And then finally, legal status. So something that the literature has very recently begun to explore is not just merely immigrant generation, first gen, a second gen, third gen on, but documentation or legal status. As you can imagine, being undocumented, which could be that maybe the circumstances of their migration weren't done through traditional channels, or they had visas that are not expired. It varies greatly, just depending on the circumstances of the legal status. But something that you have to begin to see more and more in the literature is the effect, not just being a documented immigrant, but undocumented as well. And we are beginning to see sort of minor changes and minor differences between those that are documented, those that are undocumented when it comes to offending and victimization outcomes.
If it's okay, I'd like to interject a little because I'm fascinated by this and I actually have a question for Chris. So I don't often think about these things from the sociological perspective of looking at different generations. Because I work with immigrant survivors who don't have legal status, I have very little to do with the second generation, the third generation. So thinking of it from that perspective is really interesting to me. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, particularly when we're talking about gender violence, talk a little bit about any power dynamics. If there's been research, when you have a mixed status family where one person has permanent or some solidified immigration status and the victim doesn't, can you talk about the power dynamics that come into play, particularly with gender violence?
When we consider research that involves mixed status families or groups, there is a power dynamic even within families, but sort of across social situations. I don't know too much about that area of research, but I could imagine that power dynamic will persist and is a very strong focal point that is used to exert power over a potential victim or individual. It's one of those things where, like I said, it's context specific, so it could be a bit difficult to pinpoint. But from what I can gather, that would be my assessment. What do you think?
I think the same thing, where I feel like it's just another tool in an abuser's kind of toolbox of when we're talking about power and control that they're exerting over their victim. It's just another way to keep someone in a bad situation where this status can be held over their head, or it's another threat that they can implant in the victim's mind of, you won't be believed, no one will listen to your story, I'm the one with all the power here because I speak English or I have status, and I'm going to make sure you're deported. I like what you say about the gender roles there too. I think a lot of our clients come from places where they do have some pretty strict gender roles in place. They have really strict ideas of what it means to be a woman in a relationship, and what that means in terms of sex and consent is really important, and is something we have to do a little bit of education on with our clients. So if they're coming to us for domestic violence in the traditional sense of physical force being used against someone, one of the questions we have to delve into just as a part of our legal analysis of the case is if there was any kind of sexual violence. And asking someone who comes from a country where this idea hasn't really trickled down to the culture, if you've been sexually assaulted by your husband, the automatic knee-jerk response will be no, of course not. But if you start to ask questions that delve a little bit into sexual consent, then you start to understand a little more how ideas of marriage and consent can play out in that, where they don't even have this understanding of the possibility that someone in a marriage could be sexually assaulted by their spouse. So it's a hard re-education that we have to do sometimes, where we're helping people understand the context of these things. But I didn't know if any of the research played out in that as well, where we see cultural mores kind of coming into conflict or context of US laws.
What I do know is, I think you have a really, really strong point, which is this notion of culture. When we're talking specifically about Latino immigrants, which tend to be, especially in this part of the country, tend to be the majority that we see, whether they're coming from Mexico or a Central American country or even South America, we see notions of traditionalism or traditional values. I know a major one that impacts gender dynamics is machismo. And machismo is sort of this male-oriented pride and exertion of self. And those aspects trickle down into the family unit as well. And a lot of the values and mores instilled within individuals moving to the United States. And that becomes part of that acculturation process where those value systems begin to change. But yeah, I agree. It's culture. Culture is going to be a driving factor, and it's something that needs to be heavily explored in the research. A lot of what you see in immigration, victimization research and offending, all of this research is very much in its, I would consider it to be in its burgeoning, but there's not a lot out there. And the more access to populations that we get, the more data sets that we have access to, and the more nuanced data, because as you can imagine, all the things that we talked about being an immigrant, whether they were born in the United States, whether their parents were born, a lot of existing data sets do not consider immigrant-specific circumstances or measures to really be able to measure or tap into a lot of these processes.
Sure. Well, it's hard to collect that data, particularly when you're comparing it against level of status in the United States. You're not going to want to ask survivors their immigration status in the first place. You're right. I do see this a lot in reference to Latin American culture with the whole machismo trend, but also in different cultures from across the world. So we do see a high percentage of Latin American clients, but we also see clients from India and Nigeria and China that have a lot of these traditional values in their families, where not only do we not have an understanding of sexual assault in intimate relationships, but we also don't have this understanding that domestic violence is of public concern. Domestic violence is treated as a within the family unit issue to be resolved between not only the couple, but between the two families that have come together through that marriage. And that outside of that, we don't speak of this victimization. This is a private matter, not a matter for law enforcement.
So Ms. Griesmyer, what are some of the signs of immigrant victimization?
That's a hard question to answer because, as we've already talked about, and Chris much more eloquently than me, the immigrant experience isn't just one experience. It's very diverse. It comes from a lot of different perspectives. It involves people from a lot of different ages and backgrounds and countries and cultures. But I think just to start off, that a lot of the signs of immediate victimization are very similar to that of US citizens and people with permanent status, that you're looking for both physical and emotional signs of victimization. So physically, it's things that you might expect, like bruises or scrapes or black eyes, especially bruises on the upper arms and signs that people are trying to cover up any injuries. But you can also see signs sometimes of medical neglect, things that they haven't gone to the doctor for. A lot of long-term signs of physical abuse show up like long-term health effects. So it'll show up as increased blood pressure or diabetes or long-term depression, heart issues. There's just now starting to be research that comes out about the long-term health effects of domestic violence and other kinds of violent victimization. Emotional signs are not necessarily quite as clear, but are sometimes much more common. So people will show signs of depression or distraction. There'll be long absences from work or school. There's anxiety and panic attacks, which might be a little more classic symptoms that people might connect to victimization. But it is really hard to say because everyone internalizes trauma differently. Everyone experiences it differently, and it takes an effect on both our mind and our body in really interconnected ways that come out in a variety of ways. So when I train my staff, I'm training them to deal with the behavioral side that can come out when they're dealing with people who've experienced the mental effects of trauma. So sometimes our clients have difficulty setting boundaries. Sometimes our clients have inappropriate outbursts of anger or depression or crying spells. And when we're in interviews asking a lot of really intense, directed questions about their victimization, you can trigger a lot of responses that are really surprising and unique to the person. So sometimes it's inappropriate laughter, and sometimes it's, they've collapsed onto our floor. We've had people go into seizures or panic attacks in our offices, which is really a lot for us to deal with because we're not medical or mental health professionals. But all of that is kind of classic symptoms of victimization that aren't necessarily tied to someone's immigration status. But when someone does lack status, they'll be experiencing all of those same things, but they'll have this additional level of fear and anxiety that's tied to, what if reporting this means I get deported? What if the fact that I'm sitting here talking to a lawyer means that I'm going to lose custody of my kids? What if this lawyer tells immigration that I'm here? What if I go to work tomorrow and ICE is waiting for me? So there's this level of fear and anxiety that just ramps up everything that they might already be experiencing because of their victimization.
What are some prevention strategies to reduce immigrant victimization?
Reducing immigrant victimization can be challenging. I think one of the best approaches that one can take to do this is to have what I would consider to be culturally sensitive program involved, and especially in particular communities and contexts. So really, if we're considering acculturation to be a challenging and stressful experience or integrating into the United States, then having a program that's attuned to not just language requirements or what might be going on, but also what's going on in their community and sort of where immigration and community sort of intersect. I know there are a handful of programs across the literature. There was actually a recent article that was published just last week that talks about intervention programs specifically targeting Latinx or Latino, Latina immigrant experiences, stressors, and what happens as a result of immigrant victimization, but really implementing programs in communities and schools and key areas that are involved in the developmental process that will help individuals be able to cope with what's happening, not just as a result of victimization, but being what immigration does or the immigrant status does to heightening a lot of those really disparate experiences.
I'm not a scholar, but what I can say is that my experience in immigration has been that this is just kind of a window and a filter to see all kinds of societal breakdowns, all kinds of systems that fail people, particularly people of color and people who live in poverty. So one of the big ways to help immigrant victims is to fix the immigration system. I've worked in it for 10 years now, and I can tell you that everyone on both sides of the aisle can agree that the immigration system is horrendous. The wait times are awful. You don't qualify for things. For a lot of different people, they don't qualify for anything. You can have a relative that's a US citizen and still wind up waiting 20 to 40 years for a visa to become available. It absolutely doesn't work. That said, there's a lot of good that we can do with this system. But even with a perfectly functioning immigration system, you're still going to have systems that fail because they're just not designed to work well in our current society. So if people are still working for poverty wages, if people still don't have access to healthcare, if people still don't have the ability to work and support their family, there will be systems that break down and people will continue to be vulnerable. So all these things wouldn't fix violence overnight. Humans are still human, but they can go a long way to preventing vulnerability.
I think, Elise, you touch on something really, really important, is there is a need to really reposition immigrants as a very, very vulnerable population. Part of what we see in the public narrative is the promulgation of immigrant myths or myths about immigrants in this country that really have persisted since the early 1900s, and especially post the 1965 Immigrant and Nationality Act, where we see a mass surge of immigrants in this country from Latin America, from Asia, from parts of Africa that are really, we've seen a mass migration here in the United States. And alongside that is the general need to view immigrants as a vulnerable population does majorly stem from the immigration system in general, how they even get here. And then what happens upon, the context of migration, where they settle, who are they settling with, what part of the country? Is it an immigrant destination city? Is it a non-traditional immigration destination city? Is it a small town? Are there people like them there that can help get them off their, using those informal networks? Yeah, I agree. And that prevention sort of strategy, that's a structural thing that can come from broader reform in the immigration system, which I know the American Immigration Council just released their first, it was a review of the first 100 days of President Biden's changes to the immigration system. And they provided good policy recommendations there. And the system itself is prime for targeting.
Ms. Griesmyer, what should a person do if they do become victimized?
So my answer will depend on a lot of their circumstances and what the primary needs are. As important as immigration status and documentation is, often we are not the first call they need to be making. So when someone escapes from a violent situation, the first thing they're going to need to do is call the police if they're in danger, of course, and then prioritize their needs from there. So any kind of immigration status, any kind of protection that we can offer is not going to be immediate. So generally speaking, clients can put us a little bit further down on their priorities and focus on food, shelter, safety, all of these things that are immediate needs that need to happen right that minute. So there are a lot of services that they will inevitably pass through before they come to see us, hopefully. We do get a lot of clients in crisis who just are overwhelmed by their situation and overwhelmed by all the different priorities that are competing in their brains. So we can kind of help orient them a little bit and kind of guide them to things they might need a little more quickly. So we can sit with them and prioritize what those needs might be. But law enforcement should be the first call if someone is in danger. We know law enforcement is not perfect. We know that for marginalized groups, even contacting law enforcement is a scary thing. We've gone a long way, I hope, in educating, especially the agencies we have more frequent communication with. We've done a lot of work to educate them on working with immigrant survivors, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but hopefully the priority of law enforcement is not ICE's responsibilities, is not inquiring into a victim's immigration status simply because they're there to report a crime. It should be detecting and preventing crime. If a survivor isn't comfortable contacting law enforcement, a good way to start is with local and national hotlines, but also nonprofit counseling or legal service agencies who can guide them to no-cost help and get them started on what they need to recover.
Ms. Griesmyer, how does immigrants' legal status affect their reporting?
It affects it a lot. So there's already hesitation to report depending on the crime, depending on the person, depending on the circumstances. But some of the hesitations that we see are shame and stigma, some lasting loyalty to the perpetrator that they want to protect, even if they don't want to live with them anymore. There's fear that they won't be believed. And all of these things can be heightened when the victim comes from a marginalized group. So it's not something that's exclusive to immigrants, though we do see that a lot with immigrant survivors. It's something that the Black and other ethnic minority people feel that they don't necessarily trust the police as people who will take them seriously and be interested in investigating crimes that happen against them. And they don't have confidence that police are there to protect them. It is very much true of immigrant survivors who often come from places where police are corrupt or uninterested in investigating domestic or sexual violence, especially. So a lot of that is dependent on their lack of status as well. But even documented immigrants sometimes fear that going to the police will affect their status. I've had clients who we've successfully gone through their entire case. They now have permanent residence or even citizenship, and they will call me if they're re-victimized and ask what will happen if they go to the police to report a robbery or new domestic violence. And my answer is always go to the police. I mean, they should be there to protect you. They shouldn't ask about your status in the first place. So law enforcement shouldn't collect that information. But just anecdotally, we know that law enforcement isn't perfect, of course. And we know anecdotally that undocumented victims are less likely than US citizens to report crimes committed against them. So former Houston Police Department Chief Art Acevedo came out pretty vocally against the Texas version of Arizona's Show Me Your Papers law, which was SB 4. So his argument is that if you force us as police to ask about immigration status, then we know that will make victims not come to us. And when they do come to us, we know that it'll make them close up immediately and not show up to trial and not cooperate with us in the investigation because they're scared of us. So his argument and his data to support that was that even while SB4 wasn't in effect, even while SB4 was just in the news being debated as potentially going into effect in Texas, that Latina women reporting sexual assault and domestic violence in Houston was down 30% from the previous period that year before, comparing an exact month from 2017 to 2018, I think. And he said the reporting went down so drastically that he suspected it was connected to this constant stream of news about SB4, that just the fear of law enforcement, just knowing that that's out there, any time of heightened enforcement, immigrants are going to be more reticent. So we know people don't stop being victimized at that rate. We know that it's a fear of deportation that keeps people from coming forward.
And just to touch on that, I think it's important to kind of say that a lot of crime goes unreported just generally, right? But crime tends to be underreported in immigrant communities. The greater the immigrant concentration is in a particular neighborhood, county, city, the more likely it is to be underreported. It just sort of depends on the specific context. I talked about it earlier where we talk about traditional destinations or traditional cities, the LAs, the Houstons, the Chicagos, versus non-traditional immigrant destinations, something that's more recent, say like the DFW Metroplex. And you see that in traditional immigrant destination cities, crime will go down and it'll decline the more and more immigrants make up a greater proportion of a particular area. But in non-traditional immigrant cities, sort of these newer post-1990 popular destinations or hotspots, crime reporting will drastically drop after 50th, 60th percentile, just because perhaps as a sense of legal cynicism, but also because in traditional immigrant destination cities, those resources might be there. You talked about art enforcing this particular policy, where that's in Houston. Houston has historically had many immigrants that settle there, and it's one of the most diverse cities in the country. But in non-traditional immigrant destination cities that don't necessarily have those resources in place yet, or those community ties or establishments yet, crime reporting may be more drastic or altered in those communities for different reasons, like you mentioned, perhaps fear, perhaps trust in the police, and things like that. So I really like what you said. And like you said earlier with comparing, 1 month and it drastically drops. And that's because immigrant communities are tied. They talk to one another. They know what's going on. There are such things as ethnic enclaves, groups of people that come together of various immigrant statuses, documentation statuses, legal statuses, but they share that different senses of immigrant commonalities or similar sort of racial and ethnic background. A lot of that stuff matters.
And I want to add on one thing that it might go without saying, but I think is a really important, let's finish connecting the dots of what both Chris and I are saying, is that the hesitation to report is part of what makes immigrant populations vulnerable. So if I'm someone who's going to go rob 20 people on my way home tonight, I'm not going to pick people who I think will be more likely to call the police. I'm going to pick people who I think, well, they're never going to report me, so the chances of me getting caught are a lot lower. And this is a very intentional decision that perpetrators make. So it happens in the domestic violence and sexual partner, kind of intimate partner scenario, but it also happens on a broader stranger crime scale as well. I'm not using the correct terms, Chris, but you're going to jump in and correct me on all of this with the scholarly words that I'm missing. But just from the cases that we've seen, this has been a very intentional decision made by perpetrators. So Abraham Joseph was a former law enforcement officer in Houston who intentionally, while on duty, found undocumented waitresses and sexually assaulted them on his police car. That was an intentional decision that he made. He would first talk to these women. He would ask for their documentation. When they couldn't produce any US identity documentation, the light bulb went off and he knew that these weren't women that would go and report him and that he could continue his crimes with impunity. And he did. He sexually assaulted more than 12 women before anyone had the courage to come forward, knowing their precarious situation, knowing that not only were they being sexually assaulted and had no tangible evidence to bring to law enforcement at that point, but they knew that the perpetrator was a person in a relatively high position of power. And they knew that power dynamic was going to work against them when they went in to report that crime. So it took the combined forces of several women coming together to make that point. Law enforcement officers have told me that there's a running criminal enterprise in Houston where everyone knows that in certain immigrant neighborhoods, in those enclaves that Chris was talking about, that Friday is payday, and they know that undocumented immigrants get paid in cash. So they know if they can wait until it's dark on Friday evenings and attack the first person that they perceive to be an immigrant, that they'll run a huge likelihood of being able to get cash from someone and have that crime not be reported. So these low reporting numbers that we're talking about aren't just crucial because we know that there are people suffering in silence, suffering without coming forward, but also because this is part of what makes them vulnerable, that this group will continue to be targeted and continue to be victimized until there are laws and systems in place that can respond to their particular needs and vulnerabilities.
Chris, how have current events such as the pandemic and social unrest affected immigrant victimization?
This is a broad question. This is a broad question because in many ways, the way that the pandemic has accentuated a lot of the issues that are currently happening, in addition to just general racial unrest, really puts immigrations in a more vulnerable state. So the way immigration policy has been approached in this country and evolves is it evolves, but in many ways it has remained at a standstill in many different ways. Immigration enforcement has certainly changed in I want to say the last 30, 40 years, but really it can be context, city specific, depending on where a particular destination is. Historically, immigrants have been subjected to this othering effect, seen as a social and economic threat to those here in the United States. If we kind of think about the Bracero program and the residual effects of seasonal workers coming to live in the United States, and then post 1986, after the Immigration Reform and Control Act that legalized more than 3 million undocumented immigrants, seasonal workers and those who were already in the country without sort of legal statuses or that documented status. The evolution of it has really sort of evolved, but in many ways has stood the same. When we talk about COVID-19 in the pandemic, a grouping of studies have come out late 2019 and on early 2020. Well, okay, when we think about sort of the beginning of the pandemic, right, really late 2019, December 2019, all the way to now, in early 2020, an article came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that really highlighted what COVID-19 looks like for undocumented immigrants in the United States. One of the major things is limited access to the vaccine, but that's really more, that really is an extension or highlights that undocumented immigrants aren't allowed access to health insurance according to the Affordable Care Act, which means no regular access to primary care physicians or PCPs. So not only is health at risk there, but also the pandemic, that they can't necessarily respond or gain access to sort of the effects of what impacts them for the pandemic. In addition, when we talk about immigration policy being challenged, I know Holly Ventura Miller and colleagues wrote a recent article that talked about these challenges, and they say, ICE still conducted raids when stay-at-home orders were issued around the country. Detention centers were still fully operational and really amped up the health risks there and all these challenges. And so ultimately, what does that mean for immigrants and sort of risk of victimization? We want to tie it back. Well, fear. Fear is one of the most common themes seen in qualitative and quantitative research in criminal justice and sociology. And what we likely have seen with the pandemic and this recent trend of racial unrest is that it's expanding that sense of fear and reluctance to reach out to, like I know Elise was talking about, like the police, these groups of that individuals that are slated to help immigrants in these different communities. And now, risk of victimization doesn't just fall under traditional immigrant concerns like racially and ethnically motivated attacks or acculturation, sex, legal status, and stuff like that. But it really, in my opinion, has added fuel to the fire to exacerbate things for undocumented and documented immigrants and for many children of immigrants, because they are then residually or vicariously affected by what's going on.
Ms. Griesmyer, are there any laws to help protect immigrant victims?
There are, and there should be more. We've seen a lot of strides. This has been a very, very recent development in immigration law that didn't typically set out for the purpose of protecting immigrants. Most of the laws that have been passed from the 1890s until the 1990s were designed as a barrier, keeping people out, restricting the people that could come in. So starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1890s, which called people from China lunatics and criminals, all the way through kind of the focus on Western European countries from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, immigration law hasn't been designed to recognize immigrants as whole, complete people that could benefit the United States, that are worthy of protection, and treated them as whole and complete human beings. Our immigration law is full of xenophobia and discrimination and prejudice. It's a horrible history that we have, but to their credit, we are trying to do better. So Congress has passed some laws just within the last 20 years that have taken steps to protect our immigrant neighbors. So the first real stab at this was in the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. And what that did was it tried to correct imbalances in the immigration system that we've set up. So traditionally, family immigration is one of the most common ways that people come to the United States. People that are US citizens or lawful permanent residents have the ability to petition for family members in their immediate family who lack status, whether they live here under any kind of status or live abroad. So just doing an example, if I'm a US citizen, I can apply for my husband or my child that was born in Ghana or Canada or France or wherever they might have been born. I can petition for them to get status here in the United States. But me, as the sponsor, as the person with status, I hold all of the power. So if I decide to never submit that application, if I decide to wait 20 years to do it, if I decide to submit it and cancel it 5 times, that's completely my prerogative. I don't have to explain my actions to anyone. So what Congress found, and the purpose behind passing VAWA in 1994, was they found that abusers would use that immigration process as a weapon. So they would have an undocumented family member, typically a spouse, and they would hold that immigration process over their head to say, okay, well, you can call the police to report my abuse if you want, but I'm going to withdraw my petition and I'm going to tell immigration to deport you. And as kind of egregious as that sounds, there's some truth to that. If they withdraw their petition, that spouse is here without status and potentially runs the risk of being deported away from their family members, something that happens all the time in the United States, and the deportation machinery is pretty effective. So it's a powerful, effective, and very realistic threat. So to hopefully fix some of those imbalances, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, which allows abused family members to self-petition, meaning that if I abuse my spouse can, without my permission, without my signature, without my knowledge, can step in, self-petition, and try to get the benefits that I wasn't applying to get for him. It's gone through several reauthorizations since then and several iterations where they're trying to correct different processes in the law itself, but it overall is a really powerful tool for people who have been abused by family members with status. So, which is a relatively small percentage of people when we're talking about immigrant survivors in the United States in total, because it depends on the status of the person abusing me. So if I'm abused by an undocumented person, VAWA does not protect me. So in 2000, Congress passed the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Prevention Act, the VTVPA, which I will not try to say quickly. But that act created remedies in the U&T visa, or U non-immigrant status, and T non-immigrant status, which is the formal title of the protections that they offer. Those kinds of cases are a way for people who've suffered different types of crime, including domestic violence, to obtain protection in the United States. These types of visas are a little bit different in that they not only depend on someone's victimization, but they also depend on cooperation with law enforcement. So there's this twofold purpose behind each of these visas, which is number one, humanitarian, to protect people that have been victimized in the United States, regardless of where they come from. We want to try to make that right, that as a country, we are dedicating resources to you to protect you, the survivor, and make things right, but also for the promotion of law enforcement interests. So some of those fears and hesitations that we talked about in going to law enforcement, Congress is trying to remedy that. Congress is trying to give law enforcement a tool to say, come trust us, come talk to us, come give us information, and come report crimes to us, and we will work with you to help make sure that you are protected after you do. So it's trying to build some trust between the immigrant community and law enforcement. However, imperfectly, it's trying to build a little bit of a bridge there. And it does require that immigrant survivors work with law enforcement, and not only in the initial stages of the investigation, but it's an ongoing pledge of cooperation with law enforcement as well.
I think it also might be helpful to think of, I've always thought of deportability as to exist not as a definite yes, no, for sure, but more so on a range. And a lot of the things that you just said will help better secure that range or reduce sort of a person's deportability, so to speak, that is already impacted or confounded by a lot of different factors that we've talked about today, especially that cooperation with the police. And because immigrant enforcement in this country has evolved, but it's since it is very context specific, it is harder to have these sort of sweeping national reforms done.
I like that. And I've never really thought about deportability as kind of a range, but it is fact and context specific. So immigration is not like a light switch. It's not like deportable, not deportable. You're exactly right in the way you say that. And it's a little bit hard for people who don't work in immigration every day to conceptualize this, but someone who's undocumented might mean they just haven't talked to an immigration lawyer. It might mean they qualify for 4 different paths to get status in the United States, but unless they've actually got the resources to do that and the knowledge that empowers them to go seek out legal assistance, they might not know. So all the rhetoric that you hear about people, asylum seekers entering the United States without status, they're coming in illegally. Well, no. So someone seeking asylum and coming into the United States is the way that you seek asylum. You have to come into the United States to ask for it, or else you can't get it. And then once you're granted asylum, you are no longer here without permission. So it's just this magical, like, retroactive status that we give to someone once that application has had the time to be processed through the system. Of course, these things aren't automatic at all, and your chances of winning asylum are very small. But again, the only way to get it is to ask for it. The only way to ask for it is to come here to ask for it. So people who are living here in the United States might have different options in front of them. They might not have any options in front of them, but just the mere fact of someone being undocumented is not a permanent phase of being, and it's not someone's permanent identity. It is the circumstances that they find themselves in right now, which is subject to changing facts, changing laws, changing policies, and just sometimes a conversation with a lawyer.
Final thought there. That really makes me think about this broader concept of liminal legality, which is a term that sociologists primarily came up with, and Cecilia Menjivar, who does work in this area. Basically, immigrants they occupy this in-between status, usually somewhere ranging between documented and undocumented. And the consequences of that can be really, they kind of tap into that deportability range and, the context specific. But it also, like you said, it made me think about they have to come physically into the country. That's how you gain that path to documentation there, where just generally, I like to think of it as they occupy this in-between status that no matter where they are in the process, that they're going to be subjected to these different types of experiences. So,
Chris, what is the biggest immigrant population that you've noticed constitutes a large number of victimization, such as individuals from Latin America versus Asia?
From the literature, the focus has been predominantly on Hispanic or Latino and Latina immigrants. And I think in many ways that makes sense, simply because that group of people tends to make up the majority of people that, at least post 1965, have migrated to the US. But it has changed in the sense that the projections that we are seeing for different groups of immigrants is evolving. So I know, according to recent Pew estimates, Asian immigrants are expected to be sort of the dominant group by 2065. So we may expect to see the research catch up in that way, where the focus turns to Asian immigrant victims as opposed to really following what's going on with Hispanic or Latina immigrants. But just from a pure numerical standpoint, I mean, Elise, you may have some insight into this as well. From the literature standpoint, that's just where it tends to be focused at the moment.
It's interesting to hear that that's where the literature focuses, and I'll be fascinated to see how that evolves over the next couple of decades, like you were saying, with changing demographics and changing trends in immigration, particularly when we've seen kind of a restriction on immigration from traditionally Muslim countries, that might not make its way into a trend and might not make its way into the literature for a long time. So executive policies have an effect on the people that we see coming into the United States. And typically the people that we see, just because we live in Houston and just because of who we are kind of ethnically as a city, tend to be people from Central and South America. But we do see here in Houston large populations of people from all over. So we have a large Vietnamese population, a large Nigerian population, large Indian population, and that those trends have been really interesting to watch over the last decade or so. But I think the people we see come through our doors are also a little bit skewed just naturally by our identity as a Catholic agency. So particularly when you're coming from marginalized groups or you're staying within these ethnic enclaves within the city, within your own communities, that victims, especially when they're feeling vulnerable and they're talking about their victimization with someone they need to trust, they tend to gravitate towards agencies that share a piece of that identity. So even though we don't discriminate against any client, of course, on the basis of gender or religion or nationality or anything else, that we do see the people that come to seek us out come from communities that have a connection to the Catholic faith. So if you're a Muslim survivor of domestic violence, our agency might not be the place where you feel comfortable, though we would welcome that. And of course, we've worked with Muslim clients in the past, and we have Muslim staff in the crime victims program, but you might look for an agency that you see yourself reflected in a little bit more. So there's here in Houston, a lot of agencies that work with specific groups. So we have Boat People SOS that started in response to needs from Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese immigrants. We have DAIA, who works with people from the South Asian communities. And we've seen that the victims, especially because this is such a personal, deeply intimate set of facts that they need to share, that they will gravitate towards agencies that speak to where they are culturally. Typically, that is what we see. People from Central and South America. We work primarily with women and children in my program, not because, again, of any kind of policy of ours as an agency, but because perhaps there's a higher rate of victimization, but also because, especially when it comes to more personal crimes, there is some hesitation of men to report, and then some hesitation to work with an all-female staff, which we do have in our crime victims program, that they might not feel comfortable as a teenage adolescent male or as a man over the age of 18 might not feel comfortable coming to me to tell me a story about sexual assault. So we do see that, and our doors are open for men, but we see clients that come to seek our services are naturally self-selecting and naturally will gravitate towards places where they feel comfortable.
Ms. Griesmyer, how do you handle cases with immigrants that speak different languages? Do you have a translator if you don't speak that specific language?
My entire crime victims team is bilingual in English and Spanish. Again, the majority of clients that we see that speak a different language will need services in Spanish. So all of us are fully fluent in both English and Spanish, as clients need that service as well. We also have a huge language capacity at our agency because we have a refugee resettlement program with a staff that speaks 37 different languages. So if it's something that they can help us with, they'll help us with both written and telephonic translations. Because we're a nonprofit in Texas, we have access to a service called Language Line. So if it's Amharic or if it's Urdu or a language we don't speak on staff, we can call into this Language Line, request a translator, and have them translate over the phone with clients. It's really invaluable. Speaking with clients in the language that they're comfortable with is hugely important to them being comfortable to share the details of what happened to them. And trying to work in English when someone doesn't have that capacity is confusing and alienating, but also runs the risk of us putting down inaccurate information and opening them up to denials from immigration and further repercussions after that denial. So it's really important to us that we have every detail finally mapped out and that we're very confident in the translation that we've sent.
That notion of language is fascinating and is and will remain a prominent feature in the research as well. I know some of the research that examines adolescents or immigrant adolescents in schools report that those that are learning English have greater risk of victimization in that particular context. And whether, how that relates to, acculturation stress and trying to fit in and these general socialization processes really does matter. Not knowing a language in a particular environment exacerbates a lot of the sentiments and feelings and the stressors that you feel, because communication is so pivotal to the way that we engage with one another, how we interact with those around us. And I'm really glad that you'll have translators and you'll have people that are fluent in the language, because that's something that I've always envisioned to be a very natural and very good thing to have in that particular environment, because it's necessary, especially if the majority of people come from Central and South America.
Absolutely. And if you think about, if we just think about our own experiences, if you were going to share the worst thing that ever happened to you with a stranger, you wouldn't want to have to do it in a second language. You would want to, it's already hard enough to talk about these experiences and to talk about these traumas that will live in our minds and in our psyches for so long, that to try to translate that into another language would be so difficult. I'm fluent in Spanish, but if I had to sit down and talk about my deepest, darkest days in Spanish, it would be really challenging and frustrating for me. We're trying to create this space where we're lessening the burden of reliving that trauma, that we're doing everything we can to minimize any chance of someone being re-victimized by repeating their story multiple times or by asking questions that might make someone feel judged or stigmatized or like they're having to relive it one other time or another. So the more we can do to make our agency trauma informed, the more we can do to be empathetic and supportive and really empowering people to take ownership of the process that they're going through, the easier we can make this experience and the less likely we are to have this be just another factor that they have to overcome in the future.
Ms. Griesmyer, how have the courts accommodated immigrant victims, such as having bilingual victim assistance coordinators themselves?
So the criminal justice system and even the civil justice system is not perfect still. We've seen a lot of progress. One of the actions the Biden administration just took was rescinding a policy started again in the Trump administration of enforcing ICE warrants on courthouse property, which means that ICE could show up and arrest a defendant or a witness or a victim if they were on courthouse property and if they had a warrant against that person, which obviously has a chilling effect on people even wanting to go to courthouses in the first place, regardless of whether or not they have a warrant. So like we were talking about earlier, when it comes to fears and reporting and fears of cooperation, that's a really powerful one that I think has been lessened just a little bit, but it will take some kind of consistent follow up on that for that to really lessen people's fears. They'll have to see several years of that being held up as a policy to increase their faith a little bit in the process. That said, we do hear some limited circumstances of family judges, civil judges asking survivors about their immigration status. Sometimes it is relevant to custody determinations, for example, if someone runs the risk of deportation. We're working with judges in Harris County specifically to educate them on what we talked about earlier, that someone's not just undocumented or documented, that there's a lot of different things that can happen on that spectrum and different types of immigration status that would protect people on a limited basis or on a permanent basis. Courts are doing better. And in criminal courts in particular, Harris County has come a long way, less so in smaller jurisdictions that may not have the resources to do some of these same things. But Harris County has hired on, I think, 20 additional coordinators for victims and witnesses, most of which are bilingual. And they definitely have Spanish-speaking victim coordinators that will walk people through the process. And like we were just talking about, when it comes to that language barrier, having someone who you can speak to fluently, who understands your questions and who can walk you through that process is really not only comforting, but empowering. If I have a roadmap for what my involvement will be in the court system, I'm better able as a survivor to make the decision to cooperate fully. Otherwise, if it's a big unknown, it's a very scary thing to show up, pass through the metal detector, walk into this courthouse, knowing you're going to see the person that hurt you and traumatized you. To face them across the courtroom is a really scary thing. I think there's a long way to go, but courts are doing better overall.
How do you handle challenges involving cases of children?
That's a very broad question to answer, but there are inevitably ethical, emotional, and practical challenges anytime we work with children. So typically, we're not handling minors without parental accompaniment. Though at Catholic Charities, we do have a large program for unaccompanied minor children who've come to the border without a parent or guardian. And there are always practical and ethical considerations, like I said, that we do have to take into account. Someone's capacity, someone's ability to consent and understand, truly understand the processes that we're undertaking on their behalf is limited depending on the age and circumstances, education, and background of each specific child. So it is very subjective, where we have to go on a case-by-case basis and truly understand where each child is. For the kinds of cases that I work on, one of the more frequent issues that we see is because our cases take so long to be resolved, we have time for a lot of issues to surface, where if my cases were run through immigration in 3 or 4 weeks, the chances of issues coming up would be much smaller. But some of the cases we work on take 5 to 7 years to be resolved, just a standard case. That is the average processing time for a U visa. So if we file for a child, for example, who's 10 or 11 years old, maybe 12, we have 5 to 7 years. So we see them through their entire teenage years. And as we know, trauma can resurface a lot of times in adolescence when someone is going through kind of the natural changes of puberty and fitting in high school and all of the developmental and physical changes that happen to us when we go through that really precarious and awkward time of life, the trauma and mental illness can surface in a really real and damaging way if they're not set up with systems that can support them through that process. So what we've seen a lot, unfortunately, is for our clients who have trauma, particularly sexual trauma that resurfaces in their teenage years, is we see a high incidence of risky behaviors. We see substance abuse, and we see some criminal activities, especially kind of minor infractions, curfew violations and shoplifting and things like that. We see running away and breaks with their family relationships where they become defiant and push away from the authority figures in their life. And while some of these things are really understandable, they really are, once you see them in the context of the trauma that they've suffered, these are very common reactions to trauma that they've suffered as children, but they complicate their immigration processes. So we have to adapt our case based on these newly developing facts. We have to protect them and advocate for them with immigration to really help immigration understand that these things should all be seen in context, that not to look at this conviction as just a possession of marijuana, but to look at it as someone who's self-medicating, who's trying to get through these really intense periods of anxiety and depression and PTSD. They're choosing these unhealthy coping mechanisms. And of course, they're unhealthy, but they should be seen for what they are, seen within the mitigating circumstances of the trauma that they've suffered, and understanding that this child is really struggling and is looking for help wherever they can find it, whether that's healthy or not, and that we shouldn't punish them as if they were grown people making intentionally bad decisions, that within the context of adolescent psychology and trauma behaviors, that these should be seen in that context, which is all to say that we just have to fight for them in a different way. We have to help immigration see them as people that have been through a lot.
Chris, what do you plan on doing as far as future research involving immigrants?
So I actually just started preliminary work on my dissertation. I'm basically going to examine immigrant-related offending and victimization over the life course. I'll be using a longitudinal data set to really see how offending and victimization trajectories change from adolescence to early adulthood, probably like mid-20s. And a lot of that research is necessary, as you mentioned, Elise, about kids, right? Children, they go through these really, really important developmental stages where they do things, they change, they, juvenility, and then even that transition to early adulthood. Legally, there's a lot going on there, but socially and mentally, there are a ton of changes that isn't just exclusive to immigrants sort of going through that process, but everyone involved. And as we've talked about throughout, is that immigrant status brings with it a host of issues and unique challenges that they have to overcome. Now, to couple that with developmental trajectories and what's going on is going to be really, really important, especially since we don't really know a lot of what happens as it relates to immigrant offending or victimization over time, even sort of when you model it and look at it statistically, how it changes, or the victim offender overlap in general. And it's really, really important because it's as you mentioned, at least it can be difficult to separate, but we do need to contextualize it in order to begin to reframe it, as opposed to just, oh, this person intentionally doing this wrong. It's like, no, well, there are circumstances. Immigrants sort of have this different reality and experience. Some other stuff that I'm interested in relates to the prominence of culture. So one of the things I am primarily interested in, just because of the data and also sort of my background, is Latino immigrants or Latina immigrants. So culture-specific values or culture in general, I think needs to be further explored in the research. So things like familismo or familism and notions of ethnic identity could play a role that impacts all these different behavioral outcomes across different points in the life course. But also continuing to explore mechanisms. There's a lot that we don't know about the immigrant paradox. There's a lot we don't know about why immigrants in certain situations, or second generation immigrants in certain situations, are protected or have these protective factors or risk factors for these different types of outcomes. So things like biosocial mechanisms, what's happening in the body or genetically, and also coping mechanisms and how that impacts these groups disparately. Just things like that. So just different mechanisms of offending and victimization for immigrant groups.
Can you tell me what the immigrant paradox is?
So the immigrant paradox is, I refer to it broadly, right? So it's this idea that contrary to the public narrative that says immigrants are highly linked with crime and the like, that it's actually quite the opposite, where first generation immigrants are the least likely to engage in criminal offending relative to second generation, third generation, and so on. And we tend to find something very similar for immigrant victims as well, at least compared to second generation, third generation. A lot of that has to do with sort of exposure or violence outcomes. Of course, when we talk about certain crimes like intimate partner violence, then those have their own set of unique circumstances. But trying to explain why that is, there are a lot of different explanations, some that I think really fit in well with a lot of what we're talking about, especially as it relates to fear and avoidance. I know there's a burgeoning area in the sociology literature that talks about immigrants, or documented or undocumented or otherwise, in those communities will tend to have these behavioral adaptations or potentially avoidance strategies where they, passing strategies, they're driving in the car and they see a police officer and like they try to act like they're normal, like not paying attention, not doing anything wrong, or perhaps they avoid driving at night, or just all these different things that could explain why first generation immigrants are less likely to have these outcomes.
It's really interesting. And I wonder if that's, like you were saying, playing into a lot of what we've talked about already, is they're hyper aware at all times of their precarious immigration status. And so that plays into both keeping themselves out of situations that might be dangerous for them, but also keeping themselves out of situations where they might be tempted to, or making plans to commit any kind of offense, knowing the consequences on the other side of it.
Exactly.
Really fascinating.
And if we tie that back into, say, victimization, it feeds in nicely well. It's like, well, I don't want to report that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to do this because there are these, like you said, these circumstances, and a lot of it is tied to legal status that they don't want to report because it represents a risk
Mm-hmm.
to their, what I call standing in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, basically their ability to be here,
Mm-hmm.
live here, engage with the community, have a job, be able to send remittances back home, remesas or and the like. It matters.
Yeah. And I think what you said right at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about, where I think you called it like the 1.5 generation that was born outside the United States, but came here at such a young age that they really they identify with this country. This is the country they grew up in, where they went to school and have their friends. And I think those are the clients I typically have more challenges with when it comes to criminal activity on their own record, that they might be caught up with their peer group and commit offenses that for a US born citizen might not have the same consequences that for my clients they have. So it's a really hard thing for them to wrap their minds around because they feel American. And for me, I have to say, stop it. A curfew violation for your 16-year-old US citizen friend is no big deal. You're right. It'll be on their juvenile record, whatever. For you, that's a really big deal. That's something I have to explain to immigration. That's something that's going to follow your immigration status around forever, even though under state law, it should be treated as a juvenile offense and isn't a final conviction. It is for immigration purposes. So this kind of duality in their identity of nationality is really fascinating and hard for them, I think, conceptually to wrap their minds around.
Exactly. The benefits of citizenship are vast and highly sought after for immigrant groups. It really is. When we talk about, I'm going to, anecdotally, so 1986, a lot of sort of my family owed it to that particular act to be able to have a life here in the United States. So when I talk about sort of my trajectory as a human being and my family's legacy primarily stems from Mexico, but here in the United States, it's that particular thing. And so the duality that you're talking about is something that I've endured, friends endured, every single child of immigrants endured, but also those that came here to this country who don't remember their life in another country and are, like you said, they handle that duality, but they don't enjoy the same benefits of citizenship that children of immigrants that were born here do. And it is challenging. It is extremely challenging because, like you said, it's difficult to explain. It's difficult to realize that this is the reality of that particular situation.
Yeah. So amnestia coming back is what we're hopefully moving towards. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the argument that's always been there to protect the dreamers too, is this is the only country they've known. And that's a political proposal that really gets a lot of support from both political parties. A lot of support goes into protecting the people that came here as children. And I hope that over time, with more conversations, with more education, with a growing immigrant population, that maybe we can move away from it seems like we kind of flip a switch as soon as someone turns 18, then they're no longer worthy of our protection somehow. So I hope that we can move from talking about dreamers as complex and unique human beings that are worthy of protection here in the United States, and move to a place where we can talk about all immigrants in the United States as being worthy of protection, and not have to base our opinion about immigration policy on stories of truly exceptional immigrants, of which there are many. And dreamers are a great example of this, how successful they've been and how many wonderful stories have come out of that program, and move to a place where we can make policy that's based on understanding people as complex and worthy of respect and protection, regardless of how long they've been in the country or what their current age is. And it shouldn't necessarily be based on their victimization, though I hope that there is some broader protection for immigrant survivors moving forward. But I hope that just kind of more broadly, that we can move to a place where there's bipartisan support for just immigrants in general, immigrants that aren't minors, immigrants that haven't been victimized, just immigrants in general as human beings.
Yeah, and I just hope that we could avoid similar, I want to say, backlash from, because post 1986, this notion of crimmigration really came into effect. And the immigration acts that were passed in 1996 were a big response to what happened in 1986. So I really hope that whatever reform that we're able to manage to pass, if it gets passed, although it has been at a standstill on the national level for a number of years, that it can be something that is sensitive to not just dispelling a lot of what's immigrant crime myths, but also protecting them and seeing them as, like I said, just generally as a vulnerable population. That does include protections for those who are victims or that are immigrant victims. I was talking to Elise and Taylor about this earlier, but I apologize if I fumbled my way through some of this, just because it can be difficult to pinpoint a lot of this research, because I think one of the main takeaways that we can really talk about is, yes, there are a lot of protective factors going for immigrants, but it's highly contextual. It varies from immigrant to immigrant, and so person specific, and depends on the type of victimization or crime or experience.
Absolutely.
And to try to provide sort of a cohesive look at it, it is challenging, because it is something that, at least I'm sure you can really attest to this, is that immigration is incredibly broad. No matter how you talk about it, there's so much entangled and embroiled within it.
Yeah, so it would be a lot easier if there was kind of one simple answer, but there's, of course, like anything, there's no simple answer to any of this. Even when it comes to the crime victims world, which you would think would be kind of there should be unilateral support for this. There's always some but what about this situation? And our clients' lives are so complicated and varied that it's part of the reason I love my job, is that each new person has a new angle and a new wrinkle. And it's something we have to figure out and strategize, which is really cool. But yeah, it's really hard to talk about. One thing I would love to know more about too is, I see this because of the really strict immigration backlash you were talking about to the 86 amnesty, there's been the movement across the border has been so stymied and so cut off, that I've seen in my clients this starting of two families. The family unit has been stretched across the border so far that I've seen this really common occurrence of just each side of the family kind of creates their own family unit and has their own kind of life independent of each other, even though there's this ongoing obligation financially, usually, and emotionally, that goes across the border, that each one sets up their own family unit. So I've seen a whole other family established here, but they're still supporting family back home, which is fascinating and understandable. But also, one of the repercussions I don't think Congress intended was they just stopped all movement across the border. So all these seasonal workers they depended on just stopped. They just stayed. It's astounding to me. But anyway, I would love to know more about that too.
Well, if I find anything on changing migration patterns, I'll send it along to you. It really is. The immigration world, like any particular area, and Alyssa and Taylor and y'all can attest, it's just generally in research, we're just always so far behind. We're trying our best to keep up all the data sets, secondary data sets that we use, unless we're involved in a primary data collection effort, we're talking 10 years out. And a lot of that stuff is important, but like you said, acts are passed or national trends occur and things like that in the immigration space, because it is highly contextual and dependent. You can really, put a magnifying glass on one particular area, and then, but what happens in that area may not be applicable to what happens in this other area for this group of immigrant.
I wonder if it takes 10 years, I'll be interested to see what comes out in about 6 years, because the last 4 years working with survivors has been devastating, just in so many ways. And even people who weren't touched directly, the level of fear and anxiety I saw, which was a daily occurrence when you work with crime victims, the level of anxiety that I saw in my clients was debilitating. I mean, people couldn't leave their houses. I mean, like my own anxiety ticked up. It was ridiculous. It was so much on our poor clients that are just trying to go to school and trying to take care of their kids. It was really hard to see and witness. So I'll be interested to see any research that comes out of that.
I suspect vicarious victimization experiences among immigrant groups is going to be something that will be explored much more heavily, not just as a result of what's happened in the last 4 years, but just with the pandemic and what seems to be a social justice initiative and trend that we've seen in the past year and a half.
So that was all of our questions. I just want to thank both of you for being here. You had fantastic conversations, so I'm really happy about that. Your presentations were phenomenal, and I think all three of us have learned so much from both of you. So I just want to thank you again for being here.
Thank you guys so much. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and us on, and allowing us to talk about what we're passionate about.
We would like to thank Ms. Griesmyer and Chris Guerra for taking the time to discuss immigrant victimization with us. We hope that this information will help others by raising awareness. Thank you for taking the time to watch and or listen to our CVI Talks presentation. Stay tuned for future CVI Talks. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for the latest and greatest concerning CVI.